Chapter 30 Asgard in Vinland. Settling into a high-back Clortak bullring chair, I wasn't quite sure what to expect next. Would Joseph be completely forthright, or would I have to prod him more? What was clear to me, our trip to the Ops Center had been deferred until more important business between us was concluded. Again he shifted into a militant person in the time it takes a chameleon to change its skin coloring. The latter, of course, simultaneously maintains two superimposed, pigmented skin layers, affecting light refraction. I wondered if Joseph, too, had more than one skin. One I had not seen yet. It had admittedly been a lot of years since we were students and junior officers together. He owed me nothing. He didn't defer the start of the conversation with additional small talk. What do you know about CAI? I didn't misspeak. I don't mean CIA. It is actually an acronym for Commonwealth des Gardes Internationales, headquartered in Vienna. Some people refer to its anglicized version, the Asgard International Commonwealth, or TAIC. Never heard them. Do they wear black hats or white hats? I guess that's going to be up to you soon enough, Quo. Believe me, mate, Danny and I think you have been incredibly patient with us so far. It must be killing you not really knowing with whom you are signing up. Either it's a major league compliment to me and him, possibly some hots for Rachel, or you're more desperate for a hook than we give you credit. Danny wanted me to provide this part of your briefing, but only after I had given you a little scrub myself to make sure you were committing willingly and with a balanced knowledge of the risk and rewards. Essentially, the last pass before you get the secret handshake. At your level, we don't bring people in by gaslighting them with a bunch of rosy bullshit. The fact that there is really only one central organization, the Vienna-chartered CAI, AG. The German word is Aktiengesellschaft, being the equivalent of a U.S. corporation, or LLC. Their articles of organization show them as a non-profit international aid organization, similar to Oxfam, with its Oxford, England headquarters. They're involved with enough legitimate aid activity to justify their campus and their bank accounts. However, in reality, it is nothing more than a front. Their papers never use Commonwealth d'Asgard International anywhere. They go strictly by CAI AG. It was actually formed post-World War II as a pretty far right-wing nationalist organization in reaction to the UN, NATO, Palestine, South Africa, the Warsaw Pact, and the associated random shuffling of borders by the dominant power brokers of the era. They felt the people's voice had been lost among the various puppet regimes, and they weren't entirely wrong. The best word to describe the initial organization would be anarchist. However, over time it tempered its rhetoric and aligned itself more with preserving the most enlightened democracies in the West. It dropped all the anarchy bullshit and sought to wean democracies from the most dangerous segments of society that emerged after the war. They took particular umbrage at Soviet-style communism in the 50s and 60s. It was a pretty easy jump for them to see the drug network activity coordinated in Sofia, the associated narco-puros, and the related narco-terrorists around the world as all being antithetical to their core beliefs. They broadened their self-established mandate in the late 70s to address those threats. Their governing board is made up of only extremely wealthy European businessmen, many of them with strong ties to the Mossad, although overall well-balanced between Jews and Christians. Many can trace their lineage back to an aristocratic line of one sort or another, but they refuse to use any peerage titles. They actually stay pretty true to their beliefs that way. That is, all men being equal, born with inalienable rights. Personally, mate, When I first came in contact with them, I was quite impressed. Sounds like an organization that has similar motivations as this one, just with some minor cultural twists. That's about the gist of it, quote. We feel very comfortable cooperating with them, and them with us, so far. It's too bad there's no drum roll here, mate. Your patience certainly rates it. Here's the deal. Our organization is actually called PASV. It's pronounced PASV. It stands for Preservers of the Asgard Settlement of Vinland. It has a loose fraternal, but not a corporate, relation to CAI-AG. There are no interlocking boards, bylaws, officers, missions, or financing. We just have very similar objectives and a time and joy using each other's resources. PASV is also not chartered in any U.S. state or territory, nor offshore. We have deliberately maintained an amorphous existence. Do you know anything about Norse mythology? Not much more than knowing who Thor and Odin are. Don't feel bad. Most Americans would say the same thing. Asgard is important in the mythology. It is considered both a home and a fortress, perceived to be unearthly, likely in the sky somewhere. That's where the tribe of the Aesir's live, principal gods of the pantheon. In the myth, it is critical that Asgard be maintained, and the Aesirs rule, because the latter are perceived to be the power which keep the entire cosmos intact. Also in the myth, there is a formless enemy referred to only as the Giants. It threatens to draw the cosmos back into its pre-myth pandemonium, what we would probably term today as anarchy, atoms flying randomly out into the ether. An Asgard settlement was one established as a fortress to maintain the status quo of stability, civility, mercantile trade, and the exploration during the late Viking years. In so many words, it was anti-anarchical in nature. In fact, it could be argued that it was the first organized version of fascism, government justified strictly by the existence of government itself. In prior centuries, the Asgard settlement term had some attachment to raiding and looting, but those things were more associated with the baser Vanir tribe in Vanaheim, far to the west of the Aesirs. Asgard was actually perceived by most to be an enlightened place of what we would today consider to be democratic values. So you can see, between the Vienna connection and the tenets of Asgard, our organization rapidly gravitated towards the term being in our name. The Admiral actually did the research. He found a document in the bowels of an Oslo museum that was the original official charter for a new Norse Viking settlement. From what he told me, it read roughly in Old Norse, Preservers of the Asgard Settlement of Vinland, established about 986 AD. In its body, it went on to describe a senior god known as Odin, protecting the settlement, and that the eternal resting place of all the other senior gods was Valhalla. Vinland was the Norse term for North America. The settlement's mandate, preserving the lofty principles of the Aesirs in the Western Hemisphere for the first time in recorded human history. In essence, the settlement had the same primary mission as our present-day one, and in the same geographic neighborhood. The Vikings just preceded us by about 1,000 years. When the Admiral found the document, we almost immediately adopted the name in full. We also changed the name of our ruling council from the Group of Four to the Seniors. It just seemed the logical thing to do in deference to the Asgard tenets. In addition to everything else, it just seemed a good fit with CAI-AG. I know for a fact that it pleased several of the members of their governing board with whom I have personal relations. It seemed to tie our group tighter to them, which they saw as an asset from both a logistical and public relations standpoint. Unfortunately, it also forced us to go deeper underground, for fear that CAI-AG might trade on that enhanced relationship at our expense. So far, we have had no problems in that regard. Danny has a whole alert network active to spot any undue references to us. Like them, we never use the word Asgard anywhere in our communications. The closest we come is the acronym PSAV, although for legal purposes we are still considering a possible shift to PASVSA with a Geneva location. Société Anonyme is the equivalent of a U.S. corporation in France. So far, that one has been tabled until we can do more research. Overall, most of us just use a shorter version of our name around here. We like to refer to ourselves just as AV, for Asgard of Vinland. Any questions to this point, Commander? No questions, but I am again in awe of the way things have evolved for the organization. Danny alluded to a global reach, but I always thought it was just the teams traveling for missions abroad. For the most part, that is true. We only have cooperative agreements with a couple of networks. Even then, we minimize the interaction between ourselves and them. Commonwealth Asgard International, CAIAG if you will, has been pretty aggressive about growing their networks. Oxfam reportedly works with about 20 worldwide. Last time I looked into it, CAIAG had 10 network relationships in place and 2 under development. Obviously, the purposes of the networks are diametrically different from Oxfam's, but in terms of pure scale, CAIAG appears to the public to be pursuing a similar growth curve to theirs. As you'll see, they do just enough legitimate NGO work in refugee areas to cement the perception. The seniors here at AV reviewed everything that CAIAG has been doing and decided we only wanted to work with 2 of their affiliated networks. One is headquartered in London and the other is headquartered in Auckland, New Zealand. The London operation is formally registered as the Ancient Celtic House of Asgard Limited. Around the complex, you'll hear it referred to simply as the Celtic Asgard, or sometimes CA in shorthand. Its stated purpose is purely fraternal, similar to a Masonic lodge, the Elks, American Legion, VFW, even the Philly Mummers, or the New Orleans Mardi Gras Cruise. Obviously, most purely fraternal organizations also have a charity/community service component. That fact gives CA some cover, but because they don't have a broad-based, ostensibly financial front like CAIAG, they need to be a lot more careful about how they handle their money, especially in terms of pure volume. Allegedly, some fraternals survive on some combination of annual dues, illegal gambling, revenue from slot machines and the like, internal liquor sales from on-site canteens, internal food sales from on-site kitchens, raffles, low-stakes games like bingo, and hall rentals. Most times it's hardly break-even for many of them. Clearly, it's kind of hard to explain where a $10 million deposit suddenly comes from. The Patriot Act made it 100 times worse in the U.S. Large deposits are under the microscope like never before. However, that diligence is now equal throughout the UK as a means of thwarting terrorist financing. You now have to sign what's called an affidavit of deposit source before any British bank will take a large sum. Like us, CA is dabbling with the idea of a change to a Geneva headquarters for that reason. Overall, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Minimize front activities outside the real core mission, but then no real back-end protection against tracing the organization's funds flows. The New Zealand network is formally registered in Wellington as Enlightened Asgard Crusaders of the Southern Cross, LLC, New Zealand. We simply refer to them as Southern Cross Asgard, or SCA for short. The Kiwis have taken more of a religious bent than we like. They are ultra-Christian, ergo the Crusaders part of their name. In many parts of the world, they would be ineffective because of their bias. However, when it comes to anti-democratic Islamic terror, those are the boys with whom to do business. Unfortunately, they are also unapologetically anti-Semitic. In fact, they have refused any kind of intel sharing agreement with Mossad at all. The governing board of SCA is made up mostly of a handful of older station owners with huge land holdings. However, they also have on it a former army general and a current Anglican bishop from the Aotearoa Takanga cultural stream. The bishop represents the native Maori population. I'm told that they considered the bishop from the European-leaning New Zealand Takanga, but were concerned about where his loyalties might lie. He was also known to be a rabid anti-Semite who drew a lot of press coverage when he spewed his venom. They had to pass on him. In London, the Celtic Asgard is a lot different. For all intents and purposes, but by pure coincidence, it mirrors AV here in the US. Its leadership is multicultural, multi-religious, and far less reactionary. They have no religious representation on their governing board. Although, if you ask me, they have an unhealthy lot of you fucking Irish Papists from the provinces running around. Just kidding, of course, quo. Present company is always accepted. He smiled roguishly as he assessed whether he had landed his zinger, and if it had caused any significant harmful effects. Satisfied it had not been overly deleterious, he continued. They do in fact draw their leaders primarily from England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and each is expected to be able to trace some degree of Celtic lineage. It also parallels our structure in that they are led almost exclusively by prior military men, most of them former operators or technical experts of one sort or another. SAS is well represented, but so are British ship drivers and what we would consider NSA types, many of the latter with former connections to GCHQ's Composite Signals Organization. The Celtic Asgard considers the Magna Carta of 1215 its Bible. That is followed closely by the 1689 English Bill of Rights, which laid out the framework for the first constitutional monarchy under William of Orange. It was the first time a royal agreed to specific inalienable rights of those ruled. Some say it actually laid the groundwork for the U.S. Constitution about a century later. It's well known that Thomas Jefferson was at least acquainted with it. However, the Celtic Asgard also involves a peculiar kind of spiritualism that reaches back much further, to the Druids. You may recall that they were Celts who were more than just pagan priests. They were the teachers and the judges, early delvers into the natural sciences and philosophy, at times considered evil magicians, essentially the intelligentsia of the 3rd century BC through the 1st century AD in the Celtic-controlled portions of the British Isles. The Romans never fully conquered them, but they set the stage for their demise through oppression of traditional rites, introduction of disease, and Christian proselytizing. Nevertheless, a trace of them has lingered for over 2 millennia. The Druids were in effect the guardians of law and order back then. There was also a lot of Norse-Celt intermarriage, especially in the outer islands like the Orkneys and the Shetlands. It's reasonable to assume that the Celts supported the concept of the Aesir's tribe and the Asgard protective kingdom. It fit nicely into their own pantheon of gods and myths. I don't know this for an unequivocal fact, but the Admiral tried to convince me several times that he had good intel on it. He said once a year, at the summer solstice, they hold their meeting in multicolored hooded robes, just like the old Druids. Supposedly there's some rank associated with the specific colors. The Admiral said they call it Churchill's Day, because lore has it that he was a Druid himself. Personally, mate, I think the old man was a little around the bend on all of it. On the other hand, almost all of his research has proven spot on. So who knows, eh? When Joseph paused for a second, I offered, You may not be aware, but I did 2 Navy cruises up that way. I have been all through the Orkneys, the Shetlands, and the Hebrides, as well as up in one of the relatively primitive fords in far northwest Scotland. I recall that a lot of the old-timers up there still speak the Erse version of Gaelic. However, they have no love lost for Catholics like me. I learned that the hard way. Actually, I am aware of all that. Danny doesn't miss much. Your briefing book included those factoids. Just the same, I figure that with your southern roots, you shouldn't have trouble rustling up a hooded robe or two if you have to work with them. Eh, mate? Just don't be taking any of the bed sheets out of the complex here, if you please. More seriously, there is a reason we have only formed loose relationships with the 2 networks. First, of course, it cuts down on our exposure by limiting our external contacts. However, the real reason is that we have found we can accomplish all our global objectives without extending ourselves any further. The Celtic Asgard is a formidable network that covers an area from the Baltic Sea to the Med and as far east as near Central Asia. It also leverages former imperial relationships in places like Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong, Zimbabwe, Kenya, South Africa, and a few of the Commonwealth Islands in the Caribbean. They have even been willing to squeeze Canada pretty hard on the banking issues. As such, we can tap into their resources for anything we need in all of Western Europe, virtually all of the Middle East except Israel, much of Russia, virtually all of the Balkan states, most of the old SSRs in Eastern Europe, parts of China, Singapore, and our favorite as of late, Malaysia. It's important to remember that we don't use their resources in lieu of our own. We only supplement when we are a little shy of key talent in a certain place. Basically the same thing goes for the SCA folks. It might seem on the edge of the earth way down in New Zealand. However, it is actually a perfect place for listening and other clandestine activities. Nobody asks too many questions when a sheep herder puts a huge antenna out in the center of their station. The ones who might ask get an earful of bullshit about CNN International, the BBC, or the like. They attempt to cover a territory northward from Australia, all of Southeast Asia including out to the Philippines, across all 3 major Pacific Island regions, along the Chinese coastal cities, virtually all of both Koreas, virtually all of Japan, and the Russian areas abutting the Kamchatka Peninsula. However, that's only half of their target area. Going north and west, it also includes Indonesia, Myanmar, India, Pakistan, and a few of the other stands up that way in Central Asia. The major islands in the Indian Ocean, except Diego Garcia, the Persian Gulf Emirates, the Horn of Africa, pirate areas, and all of the sub-Saharan African countries. If it seems like they are biting off a lot, they are from a geographical perspective. However, the mission types in which they have a vested interest are low volume in most of those places. We haven't used them for much other than eavesdropping, at which they have proven themselves to be exceptionally good for a non-state player. We have very quietly given them a small assist in acquiring state-of-the-art receiving and processing gear to that end. However, that limited relationship might be soon expanded. They might have some unique resources that we might need, specifically in Malaysia and China. You can see how we might ignore some of their more unsavory religious beliefs for the greater good. Another thing to always remember, SCA is not the same as the government or the people of New Zealand. Except for their registered LLC, they are off the grid for the most part. Their stated purpose in their organizational papers is also fraternal organization, but with a sub-objective of refugee aid activities pertaining to Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Nigeria, Boko Haram, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Darfur, Chad, North Sudan, and the Ukraine Crimea. Considering that they actually dislike Muslims and Jews to just about the same degree, It's quite ironic to see Palestinians included on their aid project list. If nothing else, an excellent misdirection for anybody trying to put the pieces together. The legitimate part of their front actually does aggregate quite a bit of NGO funding from international sources, and does, indeed, actually run several tent cities, all for no more than appearance's sake. A lot of it is overtly joint work with CAI AG, so they both get the legitimacy boost. There's also another dimension to SCA. They're looking down the barrel of the gun, as are my own old Aussie mates. Two of the biggest Islamic populations in the world are basically their neighbors, Indonesia and the southern Philippines. Roughly 236 million Muslims between them. In the case of Indonesia, it's actually about 88% of their total population. To win a war with them, it would have to approach genocide. Regardless of what they say semi-publicly, SCA would rather keep a lid on that boiling pot than actually get involved in the crusade, for which they say they are prepared. We both know it's bravado. If the shit really hits the fan in a worldwide religious war, the first friends those anti-Semitic bastards will make will be in Tel Aviv, so they can be brought under the nuclear umbrella. I doubt America would be equally responsive when faced with their own threats in such a war. Okay, Commander, let's take a break, shall we? I have to check on some things and possibly return some calls. The loo is over there if you need it. I'll have one of the boys bring us out some fresh coffee. As much as a single malt sounds good. Still a little too early for a nip. We still have a lot to get through. Let's resume in 30, shall we? If I run late, it won't be more than an hour. Sometimes these calls can suck me in longer than I want, but I promise you it won't be more than that. I see that bullshit smile, Quo. Yeah, I know. Danny gave you the same spiel, right? Unfortunately, he and I both work under the same pressures, and with the same people at times. Sometimes we're forced to put international tact before efficiency. Please don't take it personally. Tell you what, it's getting close to 11:30. When I get back, we'll order in some lunch and work straight through. If we don't get to the Ops Center today, so be it. You just spend another night at the inn with us. We'll get you back to Marsh Harbor soon enough, mate. With that, he was up from his chair and back through the same camouflage passageway he had used to enter Kortak. I was quite surprised he left me alone. I understood my clearances throughout the compound to still be in an accompanied only status. It was only about 10 minutes later when our breakfast server emerged with a fresh carafe of black coffee and the same services we had used in TAC earlier. I realized then that I had misjudged his age earlier in the morning. It was closer to 70 than 40, his Asian genetics masking it. He didn't say anything, but instead offered a half bow in courtesy and backed out of the room. I also didn't speak. The deference was the same I had seen many times on ships, specifically among the officers' wardroom senior mess specialist, most specifically among those who were assigned to senior command staff and flag officers. It was the deference of the proud valet or manserviced, not of one oppressed. My guess was that he had arrived with the Admiral and had assisted him in the original building of TAC to the required specifications of the steward's staff. I was to find out later that his name was Carlos de Villa, and that, yes indeed, he had been part of AV since its inception. End of excerpt. Chapter 30. Chains of the Cosmic Wanderer. The Asgard Imperative. Recorded July 22, 2019.